Right, hello everyone. I hope you're all well and having a good start to the 2021, despite all the malarkey we've been witnessing. I myself have been what well reading over a lot of stuff on the English Civil War outside of revising for exams and working, which is always a very interesting and fruitful field of discussion for a number of issues. But anyway, I'll firstly introduce my panelists for the evening. How are you doing, Justin Brown?
Good evening. I'm doing well, thank you. Gotten off to a relatively exciting 2021.
Yeah, there's been some very interesting events occurring before our eyes.
We've been watching on we've been watching live to some degree.
Yeah, it was certainly a very interesting Wednesday evening.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few of us were. I almost felt like I had a front row seat for the visit to the Capitol building.
Yeah, I mean, I found a hard time getting to sleep that night. I was like, wow, it's before we get started, do you have any content you want to share, or I'll link in the description after the stream.
Oh, just my channel. I've recently done a series on the English Civil War, which we're talking about tonight. My most recent video was on General Fairfax factions in the English Civil War. And I've been talking a lot lately about the different strange apocalyptic sects that emerged during this time. Hopefully we'll talk about them tonight.
Most definitely. I mean, there definitely seems to be amongst us in the army and a lot of the lower orders some very strange ideas come around during this era, and especially, I guess, it really wasn't an era of crisis for the UK, for the United Kingdom. I think it was 1 in 10 males were killed in the civil wars, and there was famines, economic downturns, completely new ideas in terms of modes of government. It really was an epoch-defining moment.
Yes, I mean, some people say, well, John Mortimer said that England is still divided into Cavaliers and Roundheads today. I think it is a defining era, and so many. It's like the sort of boundary between the Renaissance and modernity, I think.
It definitely marks the transition from one society to another, and especially if you can find a lot of that the raw strains of thought that would come to play such a dominant role in British and Western political and economic thought over the next couple hundred years. So it's a really just fruitful topic to actually research.
Yeah, Mencius Moldbug argues that there was a virus, a sort of revolutionary virus that started here in England and became much more powerful and virulent when it reached France. And that this is one way to think about it, that the English Revolution that we saw, it was very, as you say, resulted in the deaths of a great many soldiers. It didn't result in mass civilian casualties in the same way that the French Revolution did. Like, we didn't see, people marched out and murdered as much. I mean, there was a bit of that between the two sides.
I guess the fundamental difference was there was the idea of toleration, and it was largely a religious revolution in England, whereas France, it was definitely a lot more different issues got caught up into it, and just a completely. I mean, obviously, with different types of religion, there's completely different worldviews, but France, it seems to have taken it to another level and really focusing on some really key aspects that were a lot less developed in the 17th century.
They did in France, of course. There was a massive attack on the church because they saw the church as a feature of the Ancien Regime, but it wasn't a religious debate in the same way that the English Revolution was a religious debate. But one thing that we see in England is that the fights are really between Protestants. I mean, Catholicism does play a background kind of role in the English Revolution, but whereas in the 16th century, the religious debates were Protestant Catholic, in the 17th century, we see a shattering of Protestantism and Catholics just kind of really tend to ally themselves with the Cavalier, the monarchy. But it's not an argument about Catholicism in an explicit way. You do get accusations. For example, Charles I's queen, Henrietta Maria, was a Catholic, and this is something that led to him being accused of crypto-Catholicism, and so it was a feature, but it wasn't the overt fight between the two sides. The two sides of the English people. The argument broke down more along sort of more orthodox Anglicanism and various types of Puritanism, which became sort of tinier and tinier and more radical and more unexpected, I guess.
Indeed, I mean, you can especially with the different Christian sects. It's very interesting how a lot of it does interplay with politics in a sense, because at least in the sources I was reading, there was a sense that Arminianism was a crypto Catholicism, and it represented the old hierarchy.
Yes.
And how much you can say that's was the case, I think is very questionable. That was, but I think you actually did mention that I think you did send messages that you kind of thought Did you say that Charles was you did think he was sort of a Catholic, or?
This is a really tough question about Charles I. I mean, I think he was a high Anglican who saw a path towards possible reunion with Catholicism, but he did correspond with the Pope and he did discuss the possibility. But I do think he wanted to articulate a type of Anglicanism that would be very supportive of the monarchy. I mean, its function would be, one of its great functions would be to support the monarchy as it was and to strengthen the monarchy and to extend its power rather than be potentially in conflict with it as the church, the Catholic Church sometimes was.
Indeed, right? Well, you see a lot of, in the series, you see a lot of thoughts, modes of thinking that prop up to kind of justify the existence of the monarchy and the feudal society. So the divine right of kings actually was developed in the series. It wasn't a prolific idea throughout the Middle Ages. It was only as monarchy started to be on the wane and was in a more a stable position that it kind of developed. And same with the idea of the great chain of being, because actually one of Charles's supporters, I think it was in 1642, first wrote a political pamphlet that put across the idea of the great chain of being, which then was developed in later years.
Oh, is that right? I mean, I suspect that the great chain of being was an idea that was kind of implicit, like if you explained it to people in the Middle of Ages, they would probably see something there, but they would take it maybe for granted. Whereas maybe what they were doing was making something explicit that was almost passing out of their grasp.
I think you could definitely make that point that it was kind of reasserting the idea. I'm looking for it quickly because I have a note on it where it points from the source that I got that piece of information from, and it was I think it was from bear with me for 1 second.
So I think this idea, I mean, we can definitely see it present in the Middle Ages, but again, these people were trying to recover something that was just at the, it was just on the point of escaping from it.
Yeah, I believe it was in a 1640 political pamphlet from a man called Filmer.
Yes,
and he discussed the theory of absolute royal power. It depends on the
patriarchia.
Yeah, the actually was. Oh no, sorry. And apparently Professor Lovejoy developed this into the Great Chain of Being. This is from a source by W.H. Greenleaf that I read the other day. Actually, I don't know.
There's a famous book called The Elizabethan Worldview, like a little book that was read when I was at uni. It was considered a classic in those days, and I think some of the ideas were. I mean, it was written, in the 20th century, but I think these ideas were around, and perhaps the thinkers at that time, like we're suggesting, were making something or defending something that they
Mm.
felt was disappearing.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially with the Reformation, I think the importance of the Reformation to the English Civil War is that it opened up a mode of thinking that questioned the traditional hierarchy, the traditional way of viewing the world, and especially you start to see as in the run up to the Civil War a lot more attempts to justify the idea of the monarchy and feudal society.
Hmm. It's almost like, if you have to describe and justify the hierarchy, it's almost eluding you.
Yeah, it's
Um,
on the wane.
yeah, it's which I personally find it the whole thing tragic. The fact that, I see Charles's execution as, the literal beheading of the the body politic, and by extension the whole, of the great chain of being. And I sort of picture the society sort of like a chicken with its head cut off, kind of running around, and people just and just chaos breaking out. Really, I tend to agree with Charles's.
Mm. Well, I mean, they had effectively overturned the entire mode of society for up until for the last 200 years. I mean, if you look at the just how the governance, and it was all centered around the figurehead of the monarch, and even if you look at the local parishes, the ordinances went down from them, and it's and I've come I kind of, from the sources I've been reading, there's definitely the idea that a lot of the bishops and the various structures in place were sort of a moral and ideological justification for the monarchy. And I
Hmm.
think that definitely it does stem from the Reformation, because it opened up a box of worms that I don't think Henry VIII um or Elizabeth or any of the monarchs could really could stop, because James the First, he just almost pushed it down the road onto his son, and who probably wasn't the best fitted in terms of temperament to deal with the changes that were going on in society.
The consequences, yeah. G.K. Chesterton has a very pithy line about how, um, the that Henry VIII, plundering of the monasteries, right, and his encouraging of this whole class around him, and sort of creation of a class of people who plundered the monasteries, set off something that he perhaps couldn't have foreseen, but what happened as a result of his new policies was that the monarchy was effectively destroyed. And you could say that it never really recovered from Charles I's execution, right? Because even when they brought back Charles II, he was invited back, and it was very consciously like, whereas you used to invite us, we now invite you. We make you king, right? And so
That's
Parliament,
definitely it.
yeah. So
I
like
mean,
having,
sorry, go on.
sorry, just his idea was that, like, having plundered the church, this group of people in the next couple of generations now turned around and plundered the monarchy.
Mm. Well, and effectively, when the moment Charles is beheaded, it's the end a new epoch has begun, and within that epoch, you have the radical ideas of republicanism floating around. You have some more conservative thought as well, but it does mark a new age, and especially if you look at the middling sort and the people that benefited most from the Reformation, or at least the dissolution of the monasteries. It was an emerging middling sort which would grow on to become the middle classes, one might say, and they gained quite well financially from the dissolution of the monasteries. And I mean, even I think Cromwell was minor gentry, and for example, like Cromwell, he was pretty much just a pretty well-off farmer for the first up until I think 1628, when he had he
Yeah,
had kind of like a religious reawakening, and then became a member of parliament. And I mean, it's quite amazing how a man with no political background, no military background, ended up ruling the country.
became God's Englishman. Well, Oliver Cromwell is a very good case in point that kind of tells us a lot about this new class, because his great uncle, or great great uncle, I guess, was Thomas Cromwell, who was
Indeed.
who was Henry VIII's chancellor. he was the person who enacted the policy of dissolution. And in the process, he got a former nunnery, I believe it was, and his family became ennobled. He was a butcher's son, and he gained wealth and power and prestige, which then in turn made it possible for his great nephew. So his nephew was not, he was not a duke or whatever. He didn't have, he didn't come from nobility, but he did come from this line going back to the previous century that had gained wealth, and more to the, when you gain land, that means that you could potentially become an MP. And if you're an MP, that means you're in Parliament. And this is how, this is one of the ways by which Parliament became sovereign in the 17th century, and Parliament is still sovereign now. So if you look at, it's very instructive to study the specific examples sometimes and look at how these people, a lot of them who were on the Roundhead or parliamentary side in the English Civil War, came from stock that had benefited directly from the dissolution of the monastery.
Indeed. Well, and especially going back to the point of Parliament being sovereign, I think quite an important moment would be in 1628, when Parliament effectively threw out Charles's minister Buckingham. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a source here, and I'm not sure if this is the first time Parliament ever thrown out a royal minister and dictated to the king in such a forceful manner. But I have one observer in 1628 pointed out that by kicking out, by allowing Parliament to kick out Buckingham, the monarchy had basically laid the foundations for 1,000 other demons to pull the feathers of royalty, to appoint his councillors, servants, alliances, to limit his expenses, and on account of his revenues, which is quite just a prophetic comment, excuse me, at the time of what would later come to be the state of the monarchy.
Indeed, yeah. The Parliament went after Charles's closest sort of advisors and backers. Jacob of Buckingham was one. Strafford was the next one. Thomas Wentworth.
Wentworth.
And of course, the Archbishop Laud as well was another who they went after.
We will definitely be focusing on Laud quite a bit in the stream, actually. I think that's quite an important fact, is that throughout, at least in the early Civil War and in the run up to the Civil War, is a lot of the emphasis focuses on blaming Charles as bad councillors or evil counsel. That is kind of, so it's almost seen as a circle around him of his wife, his Lord Wentworth, and a lot of the propaganda of the era was that this was like a popish plot or a popish council against the people. And because also you have to consider that it was such a new revelation to actually blame the monarch in the sense of what they were doing, that they almost had to find intellectual justification for what they were doing at the same time.
That was always that's a cunning strategy, is to blame evil counselors around the king, because then at least you always have deniability if things go wrong and the king is, has a lot of regains a lot of power over you. You can always say, well, I was just looking out for your best interest.
Yeah, it's that old chestnut. So I think I will quickly outline how we're going to structure the stream, because unlike the first stream we did, I don't have a PowerPoint, I don't have sort of thing to keep us on track. So we more like free flowing discussion, hopefully. And so I think after this introduction we just had there, we're going to quickly discuss the historiography of this era, which is very interesting. And then following on from that, we'll discuss the pre-Civil War religion and its role in the outbreak of the Civil War, and the various policies that Charles and Laud undertook, and to kind of try to dig into it as much as we can within the time limit we've got. And then in the second half, we'll look at the Civil War itself, the various extremists or radical sects that were out there. We could look at the Putney debates and the interregnum. And we've also going to discuss a bit of Burnham and his thoughts on these revolutions, and also some of his questions that it could be interesting. This is like a thought experiment to discuss around this topic.
I guess I'd like to just say one thing for anyone, listeners, just to keep in mind that uh, religious practice, the debates about religious practice and religion had very specific practical political consequences in this time. So that's something, when because if you're not familiar with the religious debates, or you sort of think maybe, oh, this is just a sideshow or something like that, or wonder why people got so particularly intense about certain questions, for example, about whether or not to have bishops. This is, famously James I said, "No bishop, no king," because bishops crown kings. There's this the investiture of power, the idea of God's power conferred upon the king by the bishop. That would just be one example. So whether or not in church we should have bishops has this very practical political consequence. So this is just something to keep in mind.
Indeed, and to a certain extent, the parish was the intersection between the governance of the realm and the people, and in a sense, you kind of, especially in this era, you see a conflict between the two, where there's a lot of ordinary folk contesting against their ministers. There's a lot of backlash against the bishops, and it's just it's quite a forceful time when it comes to religious beliefs. You see a lot of turbulent forces at play when it comes to religion, and it should definitely not be understated as a motivation or a factor in the events that occurred, as, for example, the determinist Marxists completely underplay it as a factor.
Yeah. This is so. What I'm saying, I'm not trying to say people are not sincere in their beliefs. I'm saying they're sincere, and their beliefs have direct political consequences.
Oh yeah, of course. I was trying to build on that. I agree for
No,
certain.
Yeah.
And so there's basically four historical schools around this debate, at least that I know of. There's the Whig school, the Marxist school, the revisionists, and the post-revisionists. And so the Whig school obviously picture it as a clash between liberty and freedom that kind of built the modern British world. And Parliament
Like
was in a heroic. Pardon?
Macaulay, would you say? That?
Yeah, I've got Macaulay and Gardner as
Mm-hmm.
two notable Whig historians. And so obviously they present Parliament in a heroic struggle against the king to establish constitutional monarchy, which Whigs view as the epitome of political development. And they see the king as undermining the traditional rights and freedoms of the British people. And from that, you get a lot of myths. For example, as the idea of Magna Carta being this defining moment in British history that kind of laid the foundations of British political law.
Yeah, it's hard to underestimate how big of an influence this school of thought, the Whig school, has on us. Even if we're skeptical of it now in some respects, because we currently live in England. Parliament is sovereign, and most people take for granted that this is only right and just. So when we read about how Parliament became sovereign, we tend to we have a bias in favor of Parliament. We tend to assume they were on the right track.
I mean, even if you look at the powers that Parliament had at the time compared to now, it really does give you a sense of how far they've morphed away from what the original purpose was. Because originally they were just a tax raising institution for the king. And actually, one of the reasons Parliament gained so much power was because of the poor financial situation of the monarchy, that they had to be called quite more often than they usually would be. And it helped them to build up and slowly. I'm not saying this is some sort of plan they're getting together saying we're going to slowly chip away at the monarchy's power, but just from how it all played out, that's what happened in the sense that
That's sort of one of the big questions of history, isn't it? Like how we're going to talk about James Burnham later, but he talks about how individual intent is one of the biases of our, the ideologies of our time. Like we tend to look for individual intent, and hence, and this is one way that when people talk about, quote, conspiracy theories, unquote. It usually means that there's an over tendency to imagine a bunch of plotters or whatever,
Mm,
now this doesn't mean that there are no plotters. There are plotters
indeed,
are a fact of history.
people will always be organizing behind closed doors, but not in the term people often imagine it to be.
Yeah, and ideas replicate themselves in a way that it goes beyond sort of personal intent. So we see like power passing or clashes between elites. We see this at the time. They probably would have articulated their goals in different ways. They wouldn't have said, "Oh yeah, our plan is to make parliament." Well, some of them anyway. I mean, actually, when you read the what is the last document, the Great Remonstrance that
Oh
they
yeah, the great.
presented, their plans for Parliament were incredibly ambitious, let's say, right?
Mm.
And
I mean, I guess
the
in a,
historians, go ahead.
oh, so no, so continue. I'll make my point
Oh,
afterwards.
it's just the historian Simon Jenkins says, even today we haven't fully realized Parliament's plan for itself at that.
Indeed, it was. I mean, it was a very radical moment in many respects, and you have to. I mean, this is one of the main problems with the Whig view of history, or at least when being at this event, is I think it'll understate the various factors at play within Parliament itself, and there was such a diverse set of opinions, and at least when you after the Civil War, one of the reasons we don't get a proper settlement with the king is because there's radical elements in Parliament, there's moderate elements, conservative elements, and there's so many different forces interplaying with each other that really it it's almost just like a deadlock of what would actually happen in such a just destructive time, and I think everybody was trying to just
Yeah, it's unbelievable what a kind of incredible whirlwind was loosed.
uh,
But it would be interesting to talk about how Parliament got into the position, such a strong position vis-a-vis the king.
indeed. Well, I have kind of mentioned it a little, and I'll actually share my screen quickly because I have got a actually I think I got it somewhere. Or maybe it's not actually on this computer, but I did have quite a good image that kind of showed the financial decline of the monarchy, but I don't believe I have it with me. But I personally, I don't know about you, but I really do focus on the. I think the financial position and the economic decline of the monarchy is the real key aspect because to a certain extent the feudalism and the monarchy at the time was I view it as a economic institution. It was there to disperse property rights amongst feudal society, with the monarch being the chief property owner. And as the wealth moved away from the land to trade, to finance, to industry, it couldn't hold its position in relation to
Mhm.
Parliament. So, for example, at the outbreak of the Civil War, the House of Commons had, well, no, the House of Lords had one third of the wealth of the House of Commons, and that's not to say that. I mean, some of the House of Lords did fight for the King, and some of the Commons fought. Some of the Lords fought for Parliament, and vice versa in the Commons. But largely, the Lords was a more aristocratic and traditional institution in the sense of the feudal society, and I think in the terms of the wealth, is you can kind of see quite a clear divide on where people can land their side to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's very very revealing. And again, everybody, what we're sort of keeping our eyes in is how the class of feudal lords, who of course used to be the most powerful, gradually lost control in favor of this rising new elite, and the Civil War was how they fought it out. Now, the position of the king is kind of interesting in this. It's a complicated thing because sometimes people just imagine that, for example, it's I don't know, just the king versus everybody else,
Mm,
um, or like Parliament is this one sort of blob, which it's not. It's more accurate to say a faction of Parliament fought against
mm.
the king.
Well, yeah, there were in people forget that in the from 1639 to 1642, there was a faction supporting the king in Parliament, and there was a faction supporting the parliamentarians, or I don't want to say anti-monarchists, but I'm just going to use that phrase for the stream.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So
for convenience.
Guess we could. Do you think Roundhead is a?
Certainly. It's quite bad, but I always mix up the two. The Roundhead and the Cavalry. I always mix up the two for some reason. I can never remember which one is which. So I didn't want to.
All right, Roundheads had shorter hair than the Cavaliers, and when you look at the picture, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference as clearly as you imagine. They all seem to kind of have longish hair, but they had shorter hair and less decorative outfits.
That does make sense with the having, I guess, the especially if coming from like medieval armor, was quite decorative, and maybe that's one of the lasting influences of that.
Yeah.
And kind of, as we did talk about fantasy a little there, but I guess the next school is the Marxist school. So like R.H. Tawney, Hill, what's his name again? Christopher Hill, that's the one.
Christopher Hill, yeah.
And they're very determinist. They emphasize a lot of class conflict and the rising middle classes, as you would expect, being Marxists, and they see it as an inevitable event rising out of like long-term structural change. And I think there is some merit to this perspective, but I think it completely overlooks the role of religion. And as much as economic forces are important, and the changing structure of the monarchy in relation to the rest of the country is important, especially when you look at the actual Civil War itself, a lot of the issues, it became a very heightened sphere of religious ideas.
Well, communists tend to overlook, their religion is communism, and they're blind to its their own biases, and they tend to look at other types of religion as just mere illusions that cover over something, that covers something real, which is money and power relations, as though they're sort of, you can just easily divide the two things. But they do sometimes make good points. You're right about the economic factors.
And I think it's kind of leads on to my kind of thought in historiography as a whole. And people might say it's a bit of a milk toast, a bit of move the ground centrist position. But whenever I read in the historiography of a lot of issues, I often see it as they're all right, in the sense that they overemphasize their particular point and de-emphasize the other issues, when in reality it is a multitude of different forces and different ideas that played out to create what happened. And I mean, for example, the revisionist school emphasize the short-term factors such as Charles's personality and the divisive effects of his religious policies, which also clearly holds a lot of weight for many different reasons. With the personal rule of 11 years, for those who don't know, where he ruled without pulling Parliament for 11 years, which wasn't constitutionally illegal at all. He was entirely within his right to do that. But then from the Whigs, you get the idea of the 11-year tyranny, which is rather ironic in the sense because James I ruled for 11 years, only calling Parliament once for a very short period of time.
I believe Elizabeth I only called Parliament 4 times in her whole rule, I believe.
Indeed, so you can see how, especially with the hierarchical factors at play in when the Whigs are writing, how they projected their ideas of the development of the country onto the terms and the way they viewed the history, which many of us do, but it's very nice when you see like a quite very blatant example of it.
I mean, the Whigs and the Marxists have a lot in common, right? In that Marxists tend to see Whig, they share a lot of the same assumptions about history being a progressive affair, how one thing leads to another, how you see things in embryo, and that you need to pay attention to those things in embryo because they then become the important thing that you endorse today. Like, for example, Magna Carta, you know, they see Magna Carta as an example of the people clawing back power from the king, and they both like the Marxists value the Whigs in that they see the Whigs as just a stage in history as well. So they agree on certain things, like, oh yes, it's inevitable that Parliament should take over and Whigs should take over, but of course the next stage is socialism, right? That's how Marxists see it.
Well, you could almost say that the Marxian view of history is almost a extension of the Whiggish view of history. And obviously, we know that it does come from Hegel and materialism and that whole stuff. But you could say it is a very progressive view of history whereas the Whigs' view of marching towards constitutional democracy, constitutional monarchy, they see it as marching towards socialism and a utopia.
Yeah, they just have a further stage that they think is more important than the Whig stage.
So, following on from that, I think this would be a good place to start talking about Charles's and his Archbishop Laud's policies towards religion, and to kind of start. I think I'd make a quote from Laud, and so for people who don't know, just for a bit of the context, Laud was a Armenian minister who eventually rose to the rank of Archbishop of Canterbury. And throughout Charles's personal rule, the 11 years where he didn't call Parliament, he implemented quite a lot of Armenian policies, which were they were especially among Puritans, they were opposed, and it came quite a point of contention to the point that Parliament eventually locked him up into Tower of London and executed him during the Civil War.
And by Armenian, we do not mean coming from Armenia.
Yes, that's one point to stress.
A theologian called Arminius, right? He's European, but I forget from where. Who developed a kind of form of Protestantism that was quite high church and orthodox, and involved a lot of ceremony and kind of features that Protestants tend to consider Catholic, right?
Indeed. Well, funny enough, that really links quite nicely to the quote I have when Laud, when he was discussing the power of outward ceremony upon the minds and consciences of men. And so he said the beauty of holiness, as against the Puritan view, is that ceremony tended towards superstition, but this is the misery of superstition. Nowadays, for any man to come with a more reverence into a church than a tinker, and his bitch come into an alehouse. So he's basically saying that despite it being more superstitious in the sense of ceremony, it has an impact on the common man. It kind of helps them tie into the idea and the ceremonies around the religion. However, I do think in this time it's quite a misguided view, in the sense that when you actually see people reacting to his policies, there's a lot of distrust towards it. So, for example, I think it was in Essex when they moved the diocese to the east of the church, so the common folk can't go to the diocese. I think a lot of them are actually destroyed by the common people.
You know, it struck me while I was researching Puritanism recently that so much of what makes Catholicism work and makes it sort of a very rich part of a society was carved out by the Reformation, and what was left, like it was Anglicanism, but they'd gotten rid of the monks, right? They'd gotten rid of monasteries and everything that monasteries used to do for people, everything that they used to provide for people, which was a great deal, ranging from a place to stay on the road, to education, to doles. That's where we get our term dole. They were places where people could go and have spiritual retreat. There were places with huge libraries. They historically had all these, scientists and different forms of industry going on in them. They played this very rich role as a resource for the people. And then that was just sort of taken away. So you kind of had, in a way, like what was left didn't necessarily always support the ordinary people that much,
Mm.
I think.
So definitely. I mean, you actually see with the dole, the responsibility moves to is with the parishes now, but that is the monarch is now very has quite responsibility
Mhm.
for organizing and dishing out the dole.
There's
And
definitely a rise in poverty, like,
mm,
and a beggar class, and a lot of people who were just left to hang out to dry after the sudden disappearance of the monasteries, right?
mm,
What I'm saying is, I think that some of what we see in Puritanism, some of the efforts to get at what they felt to be early Christianity, was partly because they grew up in a world that was denuded of all this richness.
mm,
I mean, the monasteries do provide us with a model of early Christianity, and that was stripped away. So you kind of have like the elite side of Catholicism, sort of like, I mean, in terms of the ceremony and then perhaps the supporting of the larger authority, without these other aspects that are so supportive to the larger people. And
mm.
so I think that's part of why we see Puritanism develop the way it does, because they had vestiges of something, but without
Yeah,
a lot, you know.
I mean, especially, I mean, maybe one comparison would be make the fact that a lot of people now growing up with religion are turning to different sources and different uh, influences and ideas, and perhaps with the traditional religion torn away from the people, they did turn to more radical or more they were more susceptible to more radical ideas. And
Mhm.
I mean, maybe that's why, for example, when you had I mean, obviously there was the role of the Catholic Church putting these ideas down and reasserting itself, but you do have throughout before the Reformation, throughout the centuries, there are various movements that are like reformist movements that they always die down. Whereas once you have the initial Reformation, you have a whole just a whole plethora of them really spurting up across Europe, across England, across much of the Western world.
I, I think now, somebody said it makes more sense to describe the Protestant Reformation as a revolution, because
Mm,
a Reformation suggests something more like what Erasmus wanted and what St. Thomas More wanted, for that matter. These were Catholics who wanted reform in the Catholic Church and who advocated for reform in the church, but did not want the church to split, right?
yeah,
Um,
indeed.
and then you have these more radicals who, in fact, they don't reform the church. They split off from the church, and then they keep splitting off from the church, right?
Mm.
And when you look at the violence and the coming apart of society, in the 17th century, it's hard not to see that as just really the destruction in many ways of.
Well, I guess you could say the Glorious Revolution and the English Civil War were physical embodiments of these religious revolutions on an actual more physical and physical sphere.
Yeah, the effects of these revolutions just kept on coming, I
I mean,
think.
yeah, you could have. I mean, you could have. I've always seen there's two ways to view the Reformation, and obviously most people who just got taught it at school was that Henry VIII had a Reformation, Counter Reformation from Mary, and then Elizabeth settled the whole deal. But
Right.
in reality, there's either you could say the entire period from Henry VIII until the Glorious Revolution was one continuous revolution
Hmm.
where society was changing, or you could say with each monarch and each different points in their reigns, there were different revolutions, counter revolutions, and it was just developing, building upon another, and morphing into something completely different.
It certainly shows what a sort of balance had been achieved, and by just radically changing one aspect of it, he basically opened a Pandora's box.
Mm. I mean, perhaps I, I, I don't want to again overemphasize the determinist view of it,
Hmm.
but perhaps, I mean, for example, there was at the end of in Elizabeth's reign, there was a mini industrial revolution where I think it was the English wool trade took off quite heavily, and there was some other more industrial. Obviously, not in the industrialization as we think of it today, but more of more the early stage of industrialization kind of took off a little in certain areas, and there was more trade and more wealth in certain sections of society. Maybe that did contribute to something. The idea that they were building something new, we're building something better, especially with the whole religious revolution, reformation that was occurring. It kind of the two factors synthesized into one.
Yeah. I mean, there's usually in any kind of radical set of changes, there's usually we can usually point to something good, right?
Indeed,
And then, but I mean,
it's
I
usually
would,
double-edged sword.
yes. Um, okay, so where are we with the main schools?
Oh, I think we're kind of through the schools. I mean, there's the post-Reformation, the post-revisionists, who they actually argue that civil war is not inevitable, but they kind of stress like a more larger British perspective. So I think they kind of stress the idea of like Scotland, of Ireland, and the more of a British Reformation, that sort of more wide, rather than focusing just specifically on Charles and England.
I think it does make sense to talk about the wars of the three kingdoms, and talking about like what a big effect it had on Scotland and Ireland as well. Um, we know more, probably I do anyway. I know more about England, but these things also were, at least we can say they were definitely played out in those other two countries too.
Indeed. Well, I think if we discuss the Lord's policies a bit further, and then that quite nicely leads on to the Bishops' Wars and the rebellion in Ireland, because those were in a certain sense a direct consequence of the Lord's policies. Um, and I think in Lord, I mean, I think I read that Charles had instructed him to try and reinforce the traditional hierarchy with the ministers he appointed, and to kind of strengthen the traditional base of society, or the traditional hierarchy in society. And I think to a certain extent this might have been almost counterproductive, because I read one place that I think it was 1 in 10 parish ministers were kind of called out for corruption by their parishioners and there's also quite a lot of discontent because a lot of the ministers were actually from the ruling classes, having educated in Oxford or Cambridge, had an ecclesiastical education, and now they were coming here to like almost. It was. I think that you could say that the ordinary people, a lot of people saw it as like a reassertion of the traditional hierarchy upon them and its ideas, especially with the. I don't want to say that ordinary people in this era tend towards superstition, but I
Hmm.
guess with the lack of information and the general lack of education, when people are seeing these changes in their churches with Armenian policies, with and a lot of ministers from the ruling classes, and the whole ideas around Armenianism being crypto Catholicism and the disconnect between them and like London and the monarch, many people might have felt that this was a return to Catholicism or a reassertion of Catholicism upon them.
Well, over 100 years, you could say that probably maybe the ideas of the average person had moved in a more Protestant direction. Certainly at the
Mm,
beginning, the in the 16th century, the people were Catholic, and the Protestant Reformation was very much a top-down affair, right? It was something that elites imposed on them. There was very little in the way of, apart from, okay, there were things here or there like the Lollards, but generally speaking, and at the grassroots level, people were very conservative and they tended to be Catholics. And it actually took a lot, it was quite hard on them to have this just imposed suddenly. But
indeed.
like,
Well, that's one of the positives. I think it was in the 70s when the parish archives opened up to a lot of historians, is that they actually realized, like, although the traditional, especially the Whig narrative of the Reformation, was that a top-down affair. The Reformation was imposed upon England. when you actually look at it at the local level, there was a lot of differences in how the local ministers interpreted the changes, whether or not they actually enacted them or not, and how they actually,
I mean, there
how.
was, yeah,
Sorry, go on.
that just we hear about iconoclasm, like the breaking of images happening over the century, basically. But and it just kept, the fact is, like, it just kept happening because there was so much still left, right? Like,
Mm,
there was so much to attack still, because the churches tended to be, highly painted with lots of images, and that was the tradition. That was normal, and so there was always more to break because there was so much of it, right?
mm. Well, that's
Um,
I think it was in Hill's book, the Word Upside Down. He mentions that a lot of the soldiers in the Civil War would there was quite a radicalism amongst them, where they'd go around destroying symbols and crucifixes of the traditional religious order.
yeah, the New Model Army were a bunch of zealots,
Mm,
basically, and instead of being, where you hear about soldiers getting out of hand and going around looting and generally, abusing
causing mayhem.
civilians. Well, they didn't do that, but they did go around on binges of iconoclasm, right?
Mm.
So they didn't get drunk. They just went and smashed up churches instead.
Well, that's quite interesting, because I think it was Tanner who I was reading in his book on. I was actually quite lucky in the summer to go to some secondhand bookshops in the southwest, and
Mm.
I found a lot of writings by historians before World War II, and you do notice the quality of historical writing is a lot, or even just writing in whatever subject it is a lot better.
Oh yeah.
But he did point out that basically in the first year of the war, there were like traditional bishops, ministers in the armies of the parliamentarians. But then at winter, they all went home, and it was only the radical ministers that stayed, and that helped to kind of lay the seeds of radicalism in the New Model Army. Or it wasn't New Model Army then, but what come to be the New Model Army.
I think just thinking about, like, the big, who are the people when we're talking about, like, the people. I mean, the the very lowest of the low, the very sort of the poorest people tended to support the monarchy.
Mm,
There's like a historical alliance between the king and the lowly, who, and one of the roles of the king was actually to defend the lowly um, against, more wealthier lords and so on, right? So I think the king always had a really strong base,
mm.
uh, and you do, like, Jenkins talks about there being a lot of popular support for the king, which he finds surprising, but I don't. um,
It does make sense that a lot of people would support him, especially with uh, the way the poor lords were from the king, and he was looking out for them in a lot of different ways, and the way he reformed the local parishes during his personal rule. I imagine.
yeah, so I think that level of people, like, they were always quite pro monarchy, and then, but maybe the lower middle sort tended to be more pro parliament.
Mm. But that
Um,
does seem especially that the middling sort of like the up and coming, and there were actually quite a few notable aristocracy who fought for parliament and were on the parliamentary side as well. So it's not a good distinction to say all the aristocracy was for the king and all of the up and coming and the middling sort for parliament.
it's
But
just the tendency more.
yeah, it's the tendency or the
Yeah.
trend.
I think a lot of people sensed that there was a power shift happening, and probably they just had an instinct for you know,
Mm.
what might benefit them. I think that was a big part of it.
I guess much the it is almost, you could say that the working people today or the peasants back then often do tend towards conservatism, and
Mhm.
they don't prefer change at
Yeah,
all.
like, if you look, today, um, I think Moldbug refers to the Trump supporters today as, like, the sort of basically peasant
Mm.
stock, kind of, you know.
Yeah, there's definitely an apt comparison to be made there.
Mhm. And so, yeah, Trump's like a monarch. They're the sort of love their, good old
Good
king
emperor.
kind of thing. And the middle is the middling and upper middling sort that are fighting fighting the the ordinary people, and who have nothing but scorn for them.
Indeed. I actually thought it'd be quite interesting to talk about some more of the reaction to Lord's policies. So,
Are you familiar with the term thorough?
in what context?
Apparently, this was the name of his policy, thorough. And so, like, thorough is the idea that I think they're going to make sure that there's consistency throughout the kingdom.
Yeah, well, that's I think one of the things that's quite important is that Charles and Laud wanted to impose order and uniformity across religion in the country,
Hmm.
and that did lead to some very fiery confrontations, especially in Scotland. So I'll quickly share my screen.
Yeah, Scotland is where things kind of went
Can you
wrong.
see that?
No,
This is, here we go. Is it showing my?
yeah, I can see it.
So in when I think it was in 36, I believe. But there was basically I think was it Edinburgh, wasn't it? There was a
Mhm.
riot against the Lord's policies, and the minister that was reading them out actually had a chair thrown at him by a woman, as you can see here.
Yes, an uppity woman started this. This is the English Civil War, I think. She threw her chair or stool or something
Mm.
because they didn't like the new prayer book, right?
Yeah, it was the common book of prayer, which I guess you could say was it was a physical and a theoretical representation of the uniformity that Charles and Laud wanted to impose upon the kingdoms.
Now, do you suppose it had anything to do with Scottish, I don't know, just national feeling or?
I think it might be a synthesis of the two,
Mhm.
because I mean Scotland was quite Presbyterian, and there was always it was quite I mean especially it was quite hard for them to impose religious policies, but then at the same time, I, Charles pretty much spent most of his rule in England, and I think the same with James once he became King of England as well. They
Yes.
rarely ventured up to Scotland, and especially like there was kind of Scotland was quite poor at the time compared to England, and I think there was sort of some amenity developed there between them certainly. And I mean, even though Charles was Scottish, it almost came to that as a foreign king imposing his will upon them.
Yeah. Although I've heard he always had a bit of a Scottish accent, even I mean he
Mm.
was.
I do think that he didn't have a Scottish accent with a lisp. I believe it was.
Yes, have an affection for Charles.
I seem to remember you saying that in the last stream. Actually, I can't remember. Yeah.
His older brother Henry was the original Prince of Wales, and
Mm,
he died after going for a bracing swim in the Thames,
mm.
and then Charles, who was like stuttered and kind of like weak.
Yeah, it's the kind of like the overlooked younger brother.
Yeah, but he really fought hard to make himself strong and physically strong.
Mm,
And I don't. He was a great father. He was a loving husband. He had 5 children or something, right?
mm.
He certainly did a lot of what, and he had an amazing art collection. I think I did say all these good
Yeah,
things.
I mean, I was lucky enough to visit his art collection a few years ago, and it was a lot of beautiful paintings, and he had a very good taste. I'll give him that. I think isn't it the most expensive art collection of the era, or is some sort of
Yeah,
statistic or fact
yeah,
like that?
yeah.
Yeah.
He was definitely the greatest English collector king. He was a great he had amazing taste, and he knew a lot of the Baroque painters, and a lot
Mm.
of them came to. There's actually something on at the National Gallery right now. Of course, we can't go and
Oh,
see it.
great.
I think it is going to be up for quite a few months. So it's Artemisia. What is her name? She's an Italian painter who was a student of Caravaggio.
Can't say I've heard of him.
It's a lady, actually, surprisingly.
Oh.
And obviously, like, yeah, Artemisia Gentileschi, she's called, and she was invited with her father to come and paint a bunch of lovely works for Charles, and she's quite like an interesting figure. Obviously, this probably, it's probably partly to do with the fact that she's a woman, that she's got this
Mm.
big show right now, but she was quite a good painter, and just like one of Charles's favorites. So if you're interested in this era, this is worth a look as soon as they let us back into the National Gallery. You can have you can have a virtual tour right now.
Oh, it's not the same, is it?
No, but
well, one day hopefully we'll be let out from our imprisonment.
yeah. One day.
Well, actually, following up from Lord's policies, I think the impact of them in England is quite it's very interesting. So throughout the 1630s, I think it's as many as 80,000 people left, well, many Puritans left England for the new world of the continent to escape his policies. And so one agent reported that men flew out of England, like out of Babylon.
I think some Catholics went as well for after the crackdown on Catholics following Guy Fawkes's failed plot. There was a big crackdown on Catholics and Puritans, and we see quite a lot of Catholics go to found Maryland and so on.
Well, that's the thing about James's rule. He didn't really antagonize any religious groups, but any religious groups that were explicitly or threatened his rule, those are who he cracked down upon.
Mm-hmm.
Especially after the such an open expression of discontent with the king, and with from the Catholics and with the Puritans, of a lot of their doctrines that threaten the traditional hierarchy. You can see why he clamped down on them from his perspective. I mean, I think I mentioned this quote the last time, but there's some quote of him kind of pointing out that when it's something to do the end of the monarchy comes with the end of the traditional hierarchy, or when traditional common people are raising themselves up or something. I can't remember the exact quote. But yeah, following on from that, actually, I think I mentioned this before actually, but like to you on the message, but Trevelyan, he called Archbishop Laud the founder of the Anglo-Saxon supremacy in the New World, which is pretty bit of an overestimation, but you can definitely see how it's such a profound influence on English domination in the New World with such a massive flight of people.
Just this kind of unintentional kind of effect. Yeah, I mean, it was a time which, for assorted reasons, and this was one of them, there was so much energy in this country, and something explosive was happening, and it sent a lot of us out, out to create the colonies, out to explore, and whether this also, the dark side of it was that this meant the breakdown of our traditional culture, but it also meant a kind of enlarging of our influence.
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse, yeah. The 13 colonies were founded during this period. Jamestown in Virginia, reference to the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, and Jamestown was, of course, named for James I himself.
And I think it was New York was. I think they bought it from the Dutch. It was New Amsterdam. I think it was the Duke of. I can't remember if it was purchased for the Duke of York or he purchased it himself. But yeah, and that's how you get New York.
Yes. It was named for the Duke of York. Not that James II, he didn't. I don't think he actually ever went there, but it was he was the commander at the time when it was won back from the Dutch. So it was a tribute to him.
In the interest of time, no problem. Should we move on to the Grand Remonstrance, the Civil War, and the Interregnum? Because I mean, maybe we could always do a part 2 because I always kind of misjudge how long we can actually spend talking about these issues and just
Yeah.
But let's see how much we can. I probably have to maybe call it a day in about 25-30 minutes.
Okay.
But let's see how much we can get through of the Grand Roman with the actual second half of the stream discussing the Civil War itself. I think it would be interesting. Well, actually, I've got one last remark. Actually, I think in the before the personal rule, before when they held down the speaker in 1628, one of the policies that they read out that they wanted to introduce into Parliament was that any person in the Kingdom of England who advocated for Armenian policies would be made a capital enemy of the people.
Wow.
And so I think just to round off the role of religion in this in the run up to the Civil War is I think that kind of quite nicely epitomizes a lot of the feeling towards the policies, and perhaps I don't know with the sources, it may be it's quite hard to determine across the country what people thought, but I think that's quite a nice representation of how a lot of Parliament viewed Charles's, at least the anti, the Roundheads viewed as his policies in the religious sense.
Yeah, the intensity of their hatred for these policies, hard to overstate.
Mm. So I think let's discuss the radical sects that emerged in the Civil War and in the interregnum. And so you have various strains. You have the diggers, the levelers, the ranters. I think the ravers as well, isn't there?
Quakers?
Pardon?
The who?
Isn't there the ranters and the ravers?
There's a bit of raving as well, yeah.
Yeah.
Ranterism was considered like a threat because ranters tended to be antinomian. They didn't believe, they were kind of irreligious. They were openly sort of defied everything, poured scorn on everything. They went around naked. They swore at people. They cursed. They just turned the world upside down, as Christopher Hill likes to emphasize.
Yeah, quite a degenerate lifestyle they're having there. I mean, it's at least in the end of the Elizabethan and the early Stuart era, there was a kind of desire to reform the manners, because it did seem like that there also seem to be in history some of these moral scares, and I guess the Civil War intensified some of those feelings within certain sections of society.
Definitely, yes. I mean, famously, the Puritans closed the theaters, and that happened quite early on in 1642, I believe, which tells us that they had a lot of legislative power, right? Enacting policies that the king wouldn't have supported. But they had religious reasons for this as well, because they saw the theater as not only something that was, miming and aping kind of things that they disapproved of, and people were getting together close and sort of drinking and carrying on together, but also they saw it that it had a cult-ish aspect to it. So they felt that there was a resemblance between the mass and drama, which is interesting in and of itself. And so that was one of their one of their policies that was enacted to, I think it was up to 1660. There were officially no plays, but the Quakers were a kind of almost like a reforming response to the Ranters, because the Ranters were this, like we said, like chaotic bunch, but the Quakers were more they just believed in the inner light. We still have Quakers today, obviously, and some argue that that they kind of led to modern progressivism. Their ideas about religion certainly resemble modern progressive ideas about religion, but they were still more buttoned down than then ranters, right? They didn't.
Yeah, and they were quite a threat to the traditional hierarchy of the bishops and the church, because I mean that their services were there was no bishop and there was nobody actually directing it.
Yeah, it was just the only differences I would say there were. I mean, there were men and women. They had very clear distinction there, but men and women would both be able to get up in their meetings and testify. I think they just sort of they have this idea that they're inspired by I think it's the Holy Spirit that they think of as inspiring them, but that they sort of sit in silence and then some of them will get up and testify. So it was quite, they weren't Orthodox Christians. See, that's quite a big development, actually, that, that's in a time when, not conforming to, let's say, the Nicene Creed was quite a dangerous, position to take. I remember Hobbes, the philosopher, was sometimes accused of atheism, which in that day it didn't necessarily mean you didn't believe in God, but it could mean that you believed in God, but you didn't believe in providential history. So you didn't believe that God was operative. Yeah. So he always defended himself by saying nowhere in his work did he reject any aspect of the Nicene Creed. So Nicene Creed is sort of is Orthodox Christianity. And lots of people in these small groups were not Orthodox Christians, that's for sure.
And I guess one thing that's quite clear in a lot of the sources is that there was this feeling that they were on the verge of a utopia, a religious, a new world where maybe in fact God's paradise on earth. And so, for example, one royalist actually said that all sorts of people have dreamed of a utopia, infinite liberty, and especially in the matters of religion. And with all these different Protestant sects, would you say there's any uniformity amongst them? Because, for example, one historian I read, who I think I wrote an essay on this topic a couple of years ago, and I said no, the Protestants were not under any uniformed culture. But would you say there's any kind of uniformed thing amongst all of them, aside from being opposed to papism?
It's hard to isolate, because like the Quakers were not Orthodox Christians. They are not Orthodox Christians. They have very vague beliefs about the role of Jesus Christ. I mean, I believe they have, I shouldn't speak too confidently about this, but I don't think that in Quakerism, you have to agree that Jesus Christ is the incarnation of God. I mean, so things which are very basic to most Protestant Christianity, they were very vague about. So there were a lot of people around, like another group, like the Adamites were, believed in being naked. There were all sorts of. Then we had we were touching briefly earlier on the fifth monarchy men.
The fifth monarchists, yes. Actually, I'll just quickly pull up this image. It's got some of the different sects. You've got is that the Jesuits?
That's Jesuit. Yeah.
The Armenians, the Adamites, the Libertines, and yeah.
And secret, I think underneath we've got. Let's see. I'm trying to remember this one. There's Baptist or Baptists or Anabaptists, I believe.
That be here, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. This is a tract in which the writer is kind of disapprovingly listing this outbreak of sex.
The dangerous tenants.
Yeah, I think there were so many that it's hard really to keep track of them. There's one called the Muggletonians. Muggletonians is just named for a guy named Muggleton. But they had very, like, kind of almost ideas that remind you of William Blake or something, a very kind of wild, so like wild, unorthodox. Whereas when we talk about Puritans, like Puritans really do mean Calvinist, fairly orthodox Christians, even if like from a Catholic perspective they're not orthodox, but we still recognize like enough in common that we
mm,
see them as proper Christians, right?
mm,
They, for example, would agree with, I believe, all the tenets of the Nicene Creed, and they're you know very. I mean, they created very conservative cultures around them, and um, then you had like groups like the Diggers that were probably not even so much. I mean, they had definitely had a lot of religious inspiration, but I think that their ideas had more to do with agrarianism and
mm.
with agrarian communism, right? So
Yeah,
but they sprang from religious ideas, and that they believed that that God had made certain promises to man, and that you know
mm.
that
But I
one
think
of them was
there's also quite a political aspect to them in the sense that they were against Parliament and the monarchy, and they thought they were freeing themselves from the Norman yoke. So like
yes,
you can see how you can see, I think that's quite a good example there. Actually, you can see the interplay of religion and politics in this era, where they've taken a religious lens of looking at the politics of the day, and they're viewing both factions as distorting God's vision for the earth.
yes. Yeah, I think they all, perhaps almost all of them, yeah, that probably would be a shared thing, idea that they all felt that certain there were certain consequences from God, that God had promised man certain things, and that it was up to government and up to religious leaders to fulfill those promises and not deny them. But of course, they were not in agreement about what those things were, and they had apocalypse, very like literal expectations about what was going to happen now that the king was dead. Like for in the case of the fifth
Mm.
monarchy men, they believed that Jesus Christ, the literal Jesus Christ, would return to earth shortly and reign in England for 1,000 years, and that they would be his supporting,
Mhm. Well,
ministers. Basically.
I think that'd be a good moment to look at this image to kind of highlight the concerns of many people. Because at least I think you said it was it Puritan, a piece of
It's a
Puritan work.
Yeah, it's a Puritan sort of nightmare image of Cavalier and papists and like all of these bad influences that they
Mm.
saw bursting out, right?
I
But
mean, yeah, I mean, effectively, when you've cut off the head of the politique and all these radical ideas are just emerging and proliferating around the country, you can see how there's such the groundbreaking impact of what had just happened upon society.
yeah, like I mean, it's funny because from a more sort of reactionary Catholic perspective, I see this image as representing like the kind of many-headed monster of all these different groups and sects
Mm,
and bits and bobs. But from this Puritan perspective, they also saw that there is this many-headed monster breaking out and all these different influences. And I think most people felt this. Actually, oddly enough, it was kind of prescient, because this image was created in 1642, long before Charles was executed. But once he was executed, this kind of frightening sense of anything could happen now.
mm. Well, I guess
Um,
that does tie into Eamon Duffy's view of the Reformation. Is that it was a cultural hiatus that divided the nation amongst various lines and entrenchments, and once you've got the people taking up arms against the monarchy, you really open the bag for a lot of things that people may not have intended in the first place when they set off in Parliament or in the Civil War.
yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize how really radical this
Mm,
era was, because because we didn't see quite the level of murderousness happening as in the French Revolution, we don't kind of tend, this era doesn't get as much play as it should, really, because
Yeah, I mean,
arguably,
it was 150 years before the French
yeah,
Revolution, and
yeah,
it
we
was
killed
200 years. Pardon? Sorry,
we
go on.
killed being 150
Yeah,
years.
we did it first. We led the way, and then it was 200 years before the liberal revolutions across Europe as well, end of the
Right.
way to 1848.
It really seems like this. I mean, this does seem like it started it all off,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that people can really, I say, agree on, is that this was the first link in the fact the process that occurred. I mean, effectively, you could say that a lot of the Puritans went to America would eventually end up influencing the French Revolution, because I think in the French Revolution there was quite a lot of there were a number of Americans in France kind of spreading dissent.
Yes, and the Puritan Revolution influenced the American Revolution.
Mm.
Apparently, in the 1770s, they were always invoking Cromwell, for example. That was referred to by the Massachusetts governor as their darling, Oliver Cromwell. So the American Revolution, yeah, the American revolutionaries saw themselves as carrying on Cromwell's tradition. And I mean, people have argued that the American Revolution is it's the successful revolution, the one that didn't lead to a lot of civilian casualties. For me, that's the measure of a revolution. If it leads to a lot of, a lot of civilian being wiped out, or of just murderous rampages getting completely out of control, that's a little more successful. I'm not really a fan of revolutions in general, but
Yeah, well, I guess you could say that is why the Glorious Revolution was so glorious to so many people, is that it was pretty much bloodless revolution.
yeah, well, in England, of course,
Mm,
in Ireland, it wasn't so
yeah,
good.
that's a whole different bag of worms.
Yes. Well, that is the argument for the Glorious Revolution. Of course, if you're a James II fangirl like me, you pour scorn on that. But there,
Disgraceful revolution in that case.
how dare you? Well, James.
Yeah, I think I'm just trying to quickly check the time we're on. Do you want to? I think that'd be maybe a good time to discuss. I mean, we kind of touched on it throughout the stream, actually, with the idea throughout, really, the ideas of the people of the middling sort and of the aristocracy. But the going to the thing I'd say we discussed at the end is the idea of Burnham in the Managerial Revolution. He dedicates quite a few chapters to arguing that whatever ideology or set of ideas is prominent at a time is merely to justify the hierarchy that's in place. And I do definitely have quite a lot of sympathy towards this idea. But then and he obviously takes up the fact that when any revolution, whatever ideas on the other side, are merely to justify the set of elites that are revolting against the elites whose power might be in wane or deteriorating from beneath them. And I thought to finish off, we could completely discuss what merit there is to this idea in the English Revolution or Civil War, because in many respects you could say it was a bourgeois revolution, and it sprung a lot of the ideas that came associated with English classical liberalism and classical liberalism across the Western world. Then in the other sense, it was a very religious revolution, and it's yeah.
So yeah, James Burnham describes the operations of elites in the Managerial Revolution, and he claims that we are in the process of undergoing another revolution from kind of the capitalist bourgeois revolution to the managerial revolution, and he describes the process by which the capitalist elite sort of came to power, and this is 17th century, is the key time. He um, he for an example of the ideology kind of being promoted would be, the notion that we have to, that Magna Carta, which of course was from the 12th century, right?
Yeah, I believe
Was
so. Or 13th, one of the two.
that it represents like a tradition of clawing back power from the monarch for the people, and of course parliament here is said to represent the people, and that's an unexamined kind of premise, right, of that we still have today, that parliament represents the people. You need an ideology not just that will inspire the elites themselves, but that also will be accepted by the masses, because the masses are the ones who have to concede.
I mean, it ultimately has to bind the people into the system, and has to create conformity for them to go along with it.
That's right. Like you have the elites have their ideology, but the ideology has to be shared to some degree by the great mass of people. Otherwise, the elites won't be able to.
Even if it's just passively accepting some core beliefs, which I guess we have in our own day with the managerial progressive ideas around humanity.
Technocracy, like the experts, the rule of experts.
Trust the experts.
Yeah.
I guess one interesting quote that I actually found from Thomas Hobbes was in 1651, he wrote that it was under the pretense of religion that the lower sort of citizens did challenge liberty to themselves. So, and I think especially for a lot of the royalist sources, there is this sense that the idea of the religion and the religious freedoms and tolerance is merely a pretense for a new set of all of the lower sort or the middling sort to gain power onto themselves.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that one example would be, that having the Bible in translation, having the right to interpret privately, for the private individual to interpret the Bible privately. That's one of the chief kind of ideologies of Protestantism, right?
And you do see a lot of ordinary people challenging ministers, and even in there was, I think Trevelyan wrote that in the Royal Army, a corporal had a better theoretical religious knowledge than the majors and the captains, which is a bit of an probably a exaggeration, but there is that whole idea that around that a lot of the common sort were now raising themselves up.
Yeah, so the very, like, going back to the idea of individual intent and individual consciousness, I guess that the link between the Protestantism and between capitalism as such, the idea of liberty itself as being something that is desirable, that the worker should have this liberty to move from place to place, or to make contracts. That the idea that this is something desirable, and one reason why slavery is considered to be such anathema in our day, right? If you just looking at it in the kind of cold terms, right? That it's very much a part of the liberal, the liberal consensus that everybody needs to be able to sell their labor, right, freely.
Yeah, well, I think I mean that's one of the ideas that does become kind of prevalent, is that more an emphasis on private property, especially maybe resulting from some of the taxation policies that Charles pursued during the 11 years of unparliamentary rule. But I think I'm kind of I'm quite torn when it comes to this question between whether it was a justification, or because I kind of, on the one hand, I do see the ideas as emerging from the time, and it was quite a piecemeal process. It wasn't.
I don't think it's cynical.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe it's because Burnham's coming from a post-Trotskyite analysis where he's looking at power quite cynically, perhaps. And I
mean, even
sorry, go.
Hobbes, when Hobbes said that, like, I wouldn't agree with Hobbes that, or if that's what he meant, that it's a cynical sort of power play, but more
Mm,
that, it's a recognition that this idea does lead, give me as an individual more power, really,
and yeah,
But
and that is I think that's effectively where you do see the focus on the individual rights that came to define classical liberalism. And obviously we don't mean the post 1960s definition of individualism, which is cancerous in multiple different ways.
yeah.
But the classical liberalism, the negative freedoms, the freedom from things, the freedom from tyranny, you can really see how it was founded in this era.
Well, Charles also appealed to the concept of liberty in his famous speech on the scaffold. He was as much, he had that tendency as much as any other, well, I was going to say Englishman. I mean, he's Scottish, but they like Britishman.
Mm,
Um, he, as any other Briton, he, he said, to paraphrase, I prize your liberty and your freedom as much as any man, but your liberty and your freedom is predicated upon order, which only the state can give you, right? That's
mm,
his argument. Like only the monarch, only a true power, which everybody recognizes, can give you. And one of the things that Mencius Moldbug talks about in the open letter, I mean, he's very much, defending the Stuarts, because he believes that the sovereign needs to be as open and as accountable as possible, and that the great advantage of having a single monarch, right, is
mm,
that who the powerful one is, and and you can't sort of hide it and disperse
mm.
the
I mean,
power.
you can direct where all the power does flow to, whereas with our current system, with the plethora of organizations, institutions, judicial bodies, it's so hard to actually place accountability on any one thing for a specific policy or specific event that
Yeah,
has occurred.
and this is the great sort of um, the great, in our day, unsung property of of monarchy, is that it's not about one guy sitting on top of a pile of gold and lording it over the rest of us, right?
Mm.
It's about power being explicit in one
And
person.
I think there's also the sense that the monarchy should be responsible too. And this is at least one thing that Hoppe talks about in Democracy: The God That Failed, is that monarchs have that explicit incentive to ensure that there's prosperity in the realm, because they're passing on the realm onto their children. And they
Yes.
obviously, it's the same concept. Everybody works so their children can be better off. It's the same with the monarch. The monarch will work so that his own children can be better off, and as such, that will lead to the nation as a whole being better off.
Well, this is Filmer's argument in Patriarchia. Actually, Filmer. I'm sort of concentrating on Filmer these days. Robert Filmer, you brought up before, because he's the
Mm,
person that a lot of these liberals were arguing against. That's who they were responding to, is his arguments, and he was making this argument that monarchy is the right kind of form of government because it's a family, and family is a natural state, and the king should be responsible to the rest of us because he's the sort of head of the entire family, right?
well, I guess you have the dichotomy between monarchy and democracy, is that democracy will almost inherently lead to totalitarian chaos,
Yeah.
because it's not predicated upon any sound values or sound patriarchy, or
Yeah,
whereas.
you have a family who, ideally this family represents everybody, not just the people who voted.
Mm,
It's not it and yeah, like you're saying, it has an investment. That monarchy has an investment in the future, and also there's a continuity with the past.
indeed, it's almost incorporating the Burkean view of the Burkean idea of you have responsibility to the past and to the future.
Yeah.
and that's why you keep society going, and you don't create chaos and disrupt things in an overly disruptive manner.
Yeah, we have these people who have this short term, they spend all their time. For one thing, we spend 4 years preparing for an election. And then we have an election, we spend the next 4 years preparing for the next election. The amount of resources and energy and divisiveness that's poured into this. Meanwhile, you have these people with an incredibly short term view. Their idea is just to
Got
get
very
in.
very high time preferences when they're looking at how they're going to utilize the resources of the country, and they want to use it as quickly as possible, so that in case they don't have another 4 years afterwards.
Yeah, they're just dealing with this immediate set of problems that, they want to get some certain outcomes in a very short period of time and then loot everything, get out.
Mm.
And
Yeah, whereas I mean, I think you use this actually of the rump parliament. There's which is the bare bones parliament, it's also called the bare bones parliament, where I don't know if it was there were quite a few reports, especially from Cromwell. I think it was that they did see it as it had been corrupted. They were giving like contracts and monopolies to their friends, their family members.
oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I guess that was a ominous foreboding and prophecy of what would come to be democracy, with what we're currently seeing with the way a lot of contracts are given out from the government these days.
right. And they're meant to be the godly as well. That, by the
Mm,
way, the godly, you probably know this, but the godly is what the Puritans called themselves.
indeed.
They referred to themselves as the godly. So when Cromwell created called the bare bones parliament, the idea was he was calling, this godly bunch who, because they were incorruptible, right? But in Charles's last line, I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown.
He's a very tragic figure, to say the least. So I think we've covered quite a lot today. But there's definitely perhaps room for a follow-up stream on the Civil War, because I think there's definitely more areas we could discuss in terms of economics and politics and religion. Um,
Absolutely. It would be really interesting to focus just on the interregnum and that experiment.
Definitely, I mean, I think that'd be a very good thing to do next time.
Okay, sounds good.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. I wanted to keep it shorter than last time because I think we got to like almost 4 hours last time, which was it was a quite excessive to say the least. I mean, I know like Pharaoh said he listens to the whole thing, but hats off to him. But it'd be quite a lot for me to sit through a almost 4 hour stream. So I thought I'd keep it on the shorter side this time and see how much we can cover in that short bit of time.
Short and sweet.
Exactly. And ideally, maybe in a couple of weeks' time, do a follow-up stream on the interregnum. Like, I think that'd be a very fruitful topic of discussion.
Yeah, that's an area that doesn't get enough attention, and for the sheer weirdness, it's
Mm.
hard to top.
Well, I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you very much for coming on. It was and thank you everybody for watching. I hope you have a lovely day, a lovely rest of your evening, and see you next time. Thank you very much.
Good evening.